if you want to understand the breadth of the machinations on the diplomatic front. So let's look at the planes involved. Now, first of all, you had planes taking off from Germany, Slovenia, Oslo, Washington, Warsaw and Moscow, amongst many other places. And here you see those planes on the ground, on the tarmac in Istanbul. You've got the plane from Russia on the far left, Poland, Germany, Oslo, Slovenia, Dulles, and then there's a second one that's not there. A staggering amount of diplomatic, and my guess is even where they all parked had to be discussed and negotiated, the complex negotiations. John Tefft is a former US ambassador to Russia and Ukraine. How difficult are these deals?
I think these are extraordinarily difficult, Richard, and thanks for having me on today. I think this particular deal has been one of the most complex, not just because of all of the numbers, but I think because of the way the thing was negotiated. We knew back in, I think in March, if I remember right, that there was stories coming out that showed that Alexei Navalny was apparently one of the people being discussed as part of a trade. Sadly, he died then in the prison camp up in the Arctic, and that fell apart. But it was clear, and Putin has said as much at the time, that all of this really depended on getting Krasikov, the assassin, the KGB assassin, the FSB assassin, out of Berlin. And the issue, at least in my mind, has always been working this out to get the Germans to agree to include him. And part of the deal today, obviously, they got a lot of other German citizens, as well as a very prominent dissident in Ilya Yashin out of Russia.
Give me a flavour of how this happens. I mean, you know, as an ambassador or as you start to hear about the talks. Who does the talks? How do they interlock between each other? What do they actually do?
Well, I think each case of this is probably done differently or individually. I know we have a special negotiator to deal with these people who have been improperly imprisoned, but I know that my colleagues in the Foreign Service, as well as others in the U.S. government, in the intelligence community and elsewhere, work enormously long hours on these issues. And, you know, as we praise the president and the vice president and other senior officials here, I think it's important that the American people know that these things don't just happen. Hours and hours, frustration and patience are required to get this done. And there's a lot of loyal civil servants out there and Foreign Service officers who have been a part of this.
It's also part of a long history, isn't it, of Cold War?
Absolutely.
I mean, in the old days, you and I remember it, you know, people crossed bridges between the East and the West in Berlin and East and West Germany and that sort of thing. But it's still extraordinary that these things happen. And related to that, at the end of the day, we are talking here about a group of people from Russia who we say were political prisoners as such, or at least political motivated, and a group of people who were convicted by juries in Western courts.
That's right. You know, as you mentioned, you and I both can remember going back to the 80s, to the Reagan administration, when the Reagan administration was able to get Natan Sharansky out of the prison camps, out of the Gulag. And the trade was for intelligence officers back then. In many ways, this is not new, although when you have got 24 people in one big trade, it's obviously reached a level now that we haven't seen before. The other part, of course, is that some of these people, you have to conclude, that were arrested by the Russians simply to become bargaining chips, to have some collateral, some leverage to be able to negotiate to get these intelligence officers.
Is it as naked? I just want to judge you on that, because is it as naked as that, you know, that they literally round them up because they believe there is a bargain to be done in the future, and actually there's no real concrete evidence, versus on the other side, on the West, and admittedly I'm putting a Western point of view, that there's a boatload of evidence that goes before prosecutors, goes before juries? Or are we just as bad?
No, we're not just as bad. The people that we have arrested are almost all, as I think you mentioned earlier, criminals or caught doing espionage. I remember when I was ambassador in Moscow back in 2014 to 2017, the Russians raised at every single meeting the Secretary of State, John Kerry, had with Foreign Minister Lavrov. They raised Victor Bout, the famous arms dealer who was traded for Brittany Griner. There was another fellow who was later traded, who flew airplanes with drugs in West Africa. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but it was clear that the policy goes way back to then. At the time, there was great resistance in our law enforcement and judicial community to releasing these guys who had been imprisoned. And I understood that. But at the same time, the only way you're going to get people like Brittany Griner or the people who were released today out of the system, the Russian system, is to go ahead and do it. This seems to me, it's always seemed to me, as one of those really hard parts of foreign policy. There's no easy answers. There's no black and white. There's
moral hazard, John. Moral hazard. That's the argument you're looking for, isn't it? That's the one that we always go back to. Moral hazard that this merely perpetuates.
Well, but what are we going to do? I don't know of any political leader who would just say, I'm sorry, we just have to leave these people in jail there. I think in the world we live in today, Richard, it would be extremely hard politically to do something like that.
I'm grateful to you, sir. Strong discussion, strong debate. Thank you, sir. Very grateful.
Okay.
The Ambassador.
Good luck.